in poker therapy, I talk about interrupting yourself in-game. I think a lot of the process has to be fixed in-game through the construction of new habits. So actually being able to say, oh, I just noticed myself, I just caught myself making that interpretation that I was being bullied. I'm going to do nothing for a few seconds now. So sometimes I'll say to students, if you identify that pitfall happening, you know, that sort of mental habit happening, just don't act on it. Like, you can feel it and it's still going to happen within you. But I think the biggest success you can have is breaking the link from having that interpretation of the spot to then pressing that button. If you can abstain for a few seconds and just sort of feel what's going on, sometimes you can get your bearings and act differently, act in a better way. And doing that lots and lots and lots of times is the thing that forms the new habit.
What's up, guys? I've got the most orange coach that I'm aware of. He's got quite good recommendations for lower stakes coaching and his own product built out in his own kind of unique way. A couple poker books for especially the tournament grinders at 25 NL, 50 NL, these low stakes kind of things, and a lot of free content. Peter Clarke, aka what's your nickname exactly? It's Carrot Top or something? It's Carrot Poker?
Yeah, not quite. Well, the brand is Carrot Corner, is the company. And right. Carroters has actually been my screen name back in the day when I was more of a player. But these days, I guess I would just go by Pete in the poker world.
All right, so you don't have an actual nickname then. It's just Carrot Corner is the brand, and you know how to work all the corners at low stakes and get people to. What's the carrot association going on other than you're an orange and you've got some leaves with you?
I don't normally have the leaves, so this is a bonsai tree that I got for anyone that's listening and not watching. It's like one of these shrubs that you don't really have to water very often, which suits me. And it's kind of a very long, mundane and boring story. Like, I made a name, which was Character, when I was like 21 on a poker site. And then they were like, oh, you need to send us ID. And I was like, I don't want to send them ID. That sounds like too much hassle. So I made another account and added an S to the end of it, and I called it Characters. And then I played under that alias on Stars for a long time. And here we are. And then I set up a site called Carrot Corner. And the funny thing about Carrot Corner was it was originally a place where I'd write like poems and stuff as like a 20-something guy, and I would put my guitar strumming on there, some chord sequences I made up and stuff. And then it's actually been the same domain that we then turned into the coaching site, the training site throughout the years.
All right, well, it works. Okay, so here we are. I know you've written a couple books. One particularly struck out to me. I believe one's called Grinder's Manual, is that right? Mm-hmm. And the other one is called Poker Therapy. I'm curious how that one goes, because it occurred to me as I was learning poker and what I was doing well and a bit more naturally, and that a lot of what holds a lot of poker players back is that there's a number of emotional barriers. And I talk about this a fair bit because I think this is really what the issues are, but also the issues are between people in all situations, really, is there's emotional barriers to changing people's how they're wired in some kind of way to look at problems and to adjust to problems in certain ways. Rather than, I don't think poker's like that theoretically complicated. I mean, to the point of being mildly successful anyway. But to overcome these emotional barriers is kind of at the root of all problems. So, such as in poker, how do you find the courage to bluff? How do you find the courage to not listen to your emotions? Or not the courage, but the discipline to listen to your emotions. How do you, what's another example? How do you, not get too flustered in a pot, or like not let your tilt take control of you, etc. I personally didn't deal with too much of these problems myself, or I did to a degree, but it didn't affect me as much just because of how I'm wired. But I'm curious how you go about this in your book. Like, how does your book actually handle this? And do you have any coaching regimen for various issues that you identify and that you systematically fix?
Yeah. So I will say that like mental game coaching isn't the most common thing that I do, but it does creep into working with a student because I agree with you 100%. I think it's one of the biggest factors. It's like the silent assassin of poker careers that's going on behind the scenes. And it's funny you mentioned this because I actually wrote an article about 4 hours ago this morning called The Three Deadly Poker Sins. I write like a newsletter at Carrot Corner that I send out.
What are
to
the three deadly? What are they?
Right. The Three Deadly Sins, and I just made this up this morning, so don't think this is like a book that I've thought out for months or anything, but they are 1, wanting to win, 2, not wanting to lose, and 3, thinking that poker is about money. Now, you might look at those and think, well, surely you should want to win, not want to lose, and poker is about money. But I think that these are at the root of the problem that you just flagged there, which is that people's emotions, their desires, their cravings, their fears get in the way and cause their brains to run mental programs that are detrimental to actually finding the highest EV line. So let me quickly read out a quote that I tweeted today that I wrote this morning in this article because I think it's super relevant. So I said, try to see yourself as an EV worker on a production line. The hands come your way and your job is to put the highest EV bolts into the right sockets before sending the hand down the conveyor belt. Whether it falls into the losing hand bucket or winning hand bucket is not your concern. How good a job did you do? You only had one job. So that's kind of where I see it. I think that people's desires, cravings, etc., fears distract them from actually solving the EV problem. And yeah, maybe you were blessed in that you never really had as many things pulling you away from just maximizing EV.
Well, I was blessed because I had some things, but I particularly was blessed in that I was able to change these things a little bit more easily than other people's. And I was so wired logically that I could override these things more easily. Maybe there's an answer somewhere in there that it's in the constant logic overriding, or at least I've heard another therapist of sorts talk about this sort of thing. But how would you go about fixing these problems?
Yeah. So in poker therapy, we have like a kind of 3-step process. And it's really weird because this isn't actually one of the products that like I think about very much these days. It's not the main thing that I promote, or it's just a side thing in our store. But now that I'm remembering, there is like a 3-step kind of thing going on in poker therapy. So you have what's called a trigger, which is like out with your control. That could be, for example, having a losing day, having a losing session, or someone potting the river against you when you weren't expecting it, in the case of inside a hand. Then you have what we call an interpretation. And this is my own framework that I derived from like one-to-one coaching over the years and just helping people get better at mental game. I don't have a psychology degree or anything like that. I'm not a licensed therapist, right, just as a disclaimer.
Well, the philosophy background should be somewhat useful for this, I think. It's like kind of in the same vicinity.
Yeah, hopefully. So we have the interpretation, right? So we have the trigger, which is out with the poker player's control. Then we have the interpretation. And the interpretation is something that I think goes on subconsciously. It's very much like an automatic program. So in the case where somebody with the kind of aggressive looking stat line over a small sample pots the river at you or overbets, a faulty interpretation there that the human mind can run, especially if it's having a bad day and feeling threatened, could be, this person's bullying me. I'm under attack. And then it's very logical to go from that kind of interpretation to the response of the call button, right? And the idea with poker therapy is that the trigger is outside of your control, and actually the response of calling is a completely rational reaction to somebody who is over bluffing. But it's the interpretation that you're under attack and are now a victim of said over bluffing that's the problem. And then that's the kind of thing that we try to rewire. And then the next thing we do in the book is like some diagrams of like, what would a healthier interpretation be? Writing a list of the various, what we call misfires, right? The situations where these faulty interpretations happen. And we sort of rehearse healthier interpretations, visualize, actually bring them in. I think it was Elliot Rowe that I first heard this from, the Run It Once sort of mental game guy, has a course on there. He said that logic is actually normally the weakest way of treating like a faulty mental program. So while you were able to overcome yours with logic, for most people, logic is kind of like a separate language or separate currency, and it doesn't actually interact with these automatic interpretations.
Yeah, I've noticed that logic's not real big in the usual people route. So what do you actually do, especially if we're not listening to logic, which is I mean, it's kind of sadly a pretty big detriment, but I get it. Usually it's not nearly as compelling as other versions of incentives, especially in the natural world. What are we doing here now that we got a problem?
Yeah, so we can see the map via the logic. We can see the destination. So if you imagine like the logic of how we would like to handle a situation is kind of like, this is the city I want to drive to on the map. But if you could only see the city, director. Right, if you could only see the destination, but you couldn't see the rest of the map and you couldn't see the legend of where you actually were, you wouldn't be able to get to the city. So I think for most people, there's no route to actually get there. So what sure. A lot of people try to do instead is techniques like rehearsing, visualizing, emotional shifts. Like a lot of people seem to need emotional shifts, like real epiphanies, in order to change the way their brain is wired, because the emotional circuits to do with the desires and the cravings and stuff like that are just too ingrained that logic is like this weak force that can't shift them in most students' brains, in my experience.
Wait, so what kind of epiphany? What do you mean by epiphany? I thought that epiphany would be basically a logical insight. Essentially, it's philosophical insights. What am I missing here? Like, what does this epiphany look like for these people then?
Sometimes it's on an emotional level. It's like, what's the deeper mental program that's actually causing you to do this? Like, why is it that you interpret, facing that pot-sized bet as being under attack? Like, what is it about that? And I've had mental game coaching sessions where it actually it's turned into therapy in the past, when I did a lot of one-to-one, and it would be unearthed that a student that has that interpretation was bullied in high school or had a really punitive father or something like that, or maybe just that their parents modeled don't ever let anyone pick on you to them so hard that that's their default. So it can go right back to like the roots of someone's core personality, the way they're emotionally wired sometimes.
Okay. By the way, I have had this sort of an issue of just different variations of being bullied, not outright, but more like people forcing their views on me and that not liking that, and like kind of finding very creative ways of fighting back and that sort of thing. But I was always it's been more creative than more of my abrasive counterparts, I would say. It's more subtle and all that sort of thing. But I would hold it on the inside and definitely tilt soft, very subtly, personally. But I'm just curious. So they have the insight that we go through it. They're bullied in high school or whatever. Now what? How does this work? How does this get from there to we're driving to the city? We're driving to where the money's at, and we're getting the value.
Just a really long-term process. Like, the first step is identifying like why your brain is actually doing that. And the next step is taking a deliberate action, becoming aware of it. In poker therapy, I talk about interrupting yourself in-game. I think a lot of the process has to be fixed in-game through the construction of new habits. So actually being able to say, oh, I just noticed myself. I just caught myself making that interpretation that I was being bullied. I'm going to do nothing for a few seconds now. So sometimes I'll say to students, if you identify that pitfall happening, that sort of mental habit happening, just don't act on it. Like, you can feel it and it's still going to happen within you. But I think the biggest success you can have is breaking the link from having that interpretation of the spot to then pressing that button. If you can abstain for a few seconds and just sort of feel what's going on, sometimes you can get your bearings and act differently, act in a better way. And doing that lots and lots and lots of times is probably the thing that forms the new habit. So it takes a long time, is what I would say.
Sure. Okay. You actually reminded me of some real world issues, because the bottom line is that what really interests me about this is that I think that there may be some tools in poker that effectively gamify this sort of problem, where instead of facing real world consequences, which are worse than poker, poker's good because you can lose small amounts of money. Like, people think, oh no, you can lose money and you're gambling, blah, blah, blah. That's all bullshit. There's way worse things in the real world than losing money. You can lose your fucking job. You can lose loads of your time. Your time is worth more than money at a certain point. And I've been dealing with various emotional issues. I mean, basically, unless you're a perfect person, you're going to have some version of I personally call it like, there's various ways to refer to it, but inefficiency is one way. You could also call it like certain kinds of psychological addictions, etc. there must be some kind of field that goes into this, but basically, one realization I realized was that the methods of spirituality actually deal with a lot of these things to some fair extent. But it occurred to me that poker is basically like a gamified way of doing this, where now you can lose some money. So there's very real incentive. It's kind of like the same thing as setting a bet so that you'll lose money if you're honorable enough, you care about your honor anyway, that you lose your bet, you lose your money if you fuck up. And that's easier to nudge yourself a little bit. I've tried to set up systems like that. But anyway, I'm trying to think to yourself if I can apply what you're saying to other issues, such as procrastinating, for example. Mm-hmm. Do you think it works for that sort of situation where you realize, oh fuck, I want to like do something else because this is boring, instead of facing the difficulty of a situation? Like sometimes I've got to write an article, but I discovered that I personally also do this when I have to brainstorm something, and the idea doesn't come easily. Are you familiar with the field practical psychology, actually, or practical philosophy? No. Sorry, practical philosophy.
It's not. I've not really heard that term. What do you mean by that?
It's philosophy that deals with. So philosophy can deal with lots of things, and some of them are not so practical. And at some point, thinking becomes a bit useless. But when we're talking about practical philosophy, now we're talking about applying thinking to solving problems. So it goes from being potentially totally fucking useless. There's loads of philosophy that's goes into wild outer space, and then to actually solving real problems. So that's practical philosophy, and it's a little bit lesser known. But this reminded me of that because it was what helped me identify that, oh, actually, when it comes to brainstorming, I'm pretty lazy. I won't sit there and like brainstorm for like 10 minutes. And maybe the same thing. It's like, oh, there's a trigger, and then how the fuck do you deal with it? You just sit in it, I guess.
Yeah. So there's a resistance that you're experiencing to the thing that you want to do. Like, you need to do the thing. The logic is there, but there's this big resistance that makes that thing feel like a lot of effort. Yeah, absolutely. I think with procrastination in particular, just doing something is like a massive win. Like if you can break it down and say, I'm going to write a sentence. Like, can I get myself to write one sentence? And if you do that, writing the next 58 sentences is probably going to be much easier than starting off with the first sentence. So there, if we're using the poker therapy kind of model there, and we're saying the trigger is I have to write an article and it feels daunting. The interpretation is, this is a hard thing to do, basically. Then your response is, therefore, I'm going to do this easier thing to do instead. And there's a couple of ways of going about this, but I would say when I feel that way, I try to get really inspired about that thing. Like, I'm very bad at doing things I don't want to do as well. And there's two modes. You can either force yourself to do it, like make yourself your own slave and be like, you have to do this now or else, or bad things will happen. But that's not particularly effective. Like, humans don't respond well to being bullied like that. So even by themselves. So I think it's much better to try to find the life in something, man. Like when I get really into something, I get into flow state and I get lost in it. Like I'm creating a poker course, or I play bridge, and sometimes I get really into like teaching bridge or creating material for that. It's when the actual thing feels amazing to me. So it's not about me anymore. It's not about like, I have to do this. It's about me, but it's about the objective thing. And I've found that I always have more love for poker and more insight and more curiosity when I start to see like the beauty in the thing itself rather than what it means to me. So I think maybe the problem there is that when you, and again, I'm not a psychiatrist, I don't know for sure, but I would guess that when you think about that as like being a difficult task, one that's off-putting, you're actually making it more about you and what your body and mind have to currently do than about the thing itself. One solution is just to do the things you're really inspired about when you feel like doing them, because it's a lot easier than something that you feel like you've got to do.
Okay, so how would you... I mean, I do get that. That happens a bit naturally to me a lot also, by the way. But the thing is, it's a bit unpredictable. And this also, what you're mentioning is a way to go to the gym. You just fucking go to the gym. Mm-hmm. And then you do something. I personally, I did do something actually that worked for me very well in the gym, which is basically, it's almost simpler in a way because you just do the light exercises first, and that hopefully gets you in the mood to do something else, especially if you're in a really shitty mood, like do incline walking or whatever. It's pretty easy to do, or like some rows, something like that. versus the harder stuff for like HIIT, work up to that potentially. For those of the audience that are working to go to the gym. So, yeah, I'm curious how you managed to inspire yourself and what this looks like for the poker players, because I now am inspired with things with regards to poker, but I'm wondering, how are your students inspiring themselves, or are you giving them some kind of feed to inspire themselves? So yeah, tell me what that looks like for you and your students.
Cool. Yeah, this is a really awesome topic. So again, I think that people become uninspired when they become too internally focused, right? I think Jordan Peterson, I first heard this from him, but it was something like, the more time you spend thinking about yourself and your own mental state, like literally the more depressed you become, or some statement like that. And I think when a poker player is jaded and fed up and they're not wanting to study and they're playing the same autopilot game all the time and they're not doing well, they're very often thinking about their own bankroll, where they would like to be versus where they are, how poker makes them feel. And my solution to that is, I need to get them inspired to geek out. I need to get them to fall in love with what poker actually is, the intricacies of some spots. So for me, geeking out is the solution to that. And I love teaching because it makes my geeking out external. It gives me an outlet for that geeking out. I can share it with other people. I can be social about it. But that's it in a nutshell. If you've gotten into poker for the strategic love of the game, and that makes that makes you tick, I think that's rediscoverable if you can just like work with the right person, or just a lot of time it's behavioral. It's just like, what's this person's mood? Like, what do I need to say? Like, that's definitely a part of it. It's just like having some people skills. But if you've gotten into poker because you just want freedom, you have extrinsic reasons, you just want you want a job where you don't have a boss breathing down your neck, or you want more money or something like that, or you want to travel, well, you're using poker as a means to an end rather than as an end in and of itself. And it's very hard to get motivation to do a thing when it's just a means to an end. So I think you've just got to like really get into the strategy side of things and fall in love with that. And if you can't fall in love with strategy and logic, maybe poker's not really for you and you're just using it to suit your needs or your lifestyle.
You actually bring up a really good point, because this is kind of my selling point was, okay, poker is a means to your freedom. It's definitely not for everyone, though. We've established that it's not for everyone. It is definitely for the ones that are logically minded, which, by the way, I am going after. But that's actually what inspired me, was this whole idea that it is a means to freedom, that you can be your own fucking boss and do whatever you want. It's actually very valuable. But that's more my incentive of creating that funnel. Actually, you brought up a good point, which is, yeah, so what are some examples of falling in love with that, of some situations that may be mundane? Like, I can give you something that's mundane for me. Let's see if you can help me. When I'm playing tournaments and I'm playing 20 big blind, I can tell you my own personal solution to this,
cool.
Which is actually working in an important direction. But first, I want your opinion. 20 big blind poker, 10 big blind poker at a tournament with not the easiest people in the world to read. Let's say they're probably going to have some tells, but they're not, like, tournaments are usually quite dry. People are very serious in tournaments. So tell me how I'm supposed to fall in love with that. And then we'll see what you say for your students at 25 and L. We'll see if there's a couple situations for them.
So, yeah, like, I fell in love with poker again the other day when I was making a course, and the episode of the course I was making was about different sizes of delayed c-bet and when you would want to use like the block size, what textures those would be, and when you would want to use the bigger size. And that gets quite intricate, and it's really interesting, and there's an exploitative angle too, and that's easy to geek out with, right? So like, that was easy. I fell in love. That's like kind of like level 1 of falling in love with the game. When you're doing something really cool like that, it's easier. Okay, 10 big blind tournament play with very serious people at like 28 hands an hour. This has to be one of the ultimate challenges for falling in love with it. That's maybe asking like, how do you fall in love with doing the dishes or the laundry? And it might be that that's not possible. And so I don't actually know. My sense would be that you need to find something more complex and intricate in the apparently simple. And that could mean that like, maybe these people are actually more readable than you think, but only if you pay super close attention. And you get really into like just watching them between hands when you're not doing anything and observing. I know you're quite a curious guy, so maybe that comes naturally to you. But I don't know, in terms of the actual strategy of the push fold game at that point in a tournament, that's a lot harder to fall in love with than, examining 100 big blind deep turn probe strategies or something.
Okay, well, I'll tell you my current solution, which is a required solution actually for a lot of poker players. Actually, poker would be more enjoyable. It would be one of the steps towards making poker more enjoyable for everyone, I think. But basically, one of the solutions, there's a different problem that I had, which is how do I become good at banter and how do I become good at being social in, it leads to a lot of things I'm personally doing. How do I become good at being social in a way that isn't so functional? I personally was very my mind was very functional. How do you solve a problem? A, B, C, whatever, very like almost robotic in that sense. And it was quite a challenge for me to switch towards banter, etc. But I decided to like kind of, at one point I realized all the elements of improv are basically in poker. You have some sort of context given to you inherently, and a bunch of random things happen. Now you just have to play and make some fun out of it. And so what I would do, I'd be sitting there bored and I would just try to like basically do what I do if I was going to go out to a bar where you don't always have context actually. And this would be like the leading up to that of sorts. It's not quite going out to a bar, but it's like almost like training for those situations. So I would just sit there and think of funny things to say. The other day I'll give you a story. I played once with Phil Hellmuth, and he made a terrible mistake. It was three-handed and it was on the bubble, and he had like 3 big blinds. And he said, "This is where I play better than everybody else." I'm like, bro, where the fuck are you going to do? That's so great. And so what happens next is he limps with 3 big blinds, I believe, versus the chip leader. Brilliant play already. And I'm like, okay, I don't think that's right. And the other guy checks back. The flop is something like Queen 8-9. He decides to bet, and the other guy goes all in. He folds, and the other guy shows 10-4 offsuit. I'm just like, was this the difference? I don't really understand this one. And then, of course, he busts straightly after, but that's my personal favorite Phil experience. So I decided to learn from his example. I said, at 10 big blinds, this is where I play the best in the world. And I think at like 6 big blinds, I 3x'd and then got jammed on and lost. But I learned some moves from Phil Hellmuth and at least injected a little bit of fun into the game. I brought a little bit of soul to it. There's probably more examples, but that's my personal solution, is inject the elements of improv to what's otherwise dry as fuck. Because actually, when you take away all the emotional ups and downs of something, it becomes very dry. That was my own spiritual lesson of sorts. This applies to anything. And that's the only solution I can think of. But, any thoughts before we talk about how you help your students other than the delay c-bet situation before you go into some other examples?
Sure. So yeah, this is the eternal problem of like live poker. So I teach online players, but we also teach some live players as well. And that could just be sitting with someone going over hand histories that they've written down in a little book or whatever on their phone when they're playing live. And my experience with live poker is very limited. I actually personally hate it. I'm not a fan at all. And that's because I don't like doing nothing for long periods of time. I find the action that's going on around me at a live table incredibly tedious and boring and just awful. And I'm not great socially in groups of people I don't know. I'm the kind of person that if I have my community and my friends and people I've come to know a little bit, or I'm in my comfort zone, I'm very, very like social, and I'm a fairly relaxed guy. But when it comes to like sitting at a table with 8 other humans that I don't know, and they're not usually people I'd normally hang out with like in real life, it's probably a bit different if you're playing like a higher stakes tournament circuit or something like that. But I remember in the early days when I was playing more than coaching, I just would feel, really like I didn't know how to be social in that environment. And normally I'm quite good socially. So I think it just depends on the type of people you're around. And I could never I was very bad at like forcing small talk with people that I didn't have a lot to say to.
No, it's not. No. I secretly think everyone hates small talk, but I could be wrong. I want to find this out.
No, I think there are people that love it. I think there are actually people who are like social robots that are just really good at small talk, and they scare the hell out of me.
How really good can you be at small talk? Hey,
people
how
can be
are
really
you?
Good.
Like, how's your family doing? Just random questions.
Yeah, but it's even worse than that. It's like we have like chickens and goats and stuff like that. I live on like what's called a small holding with my wife, and sometimes someone will come and deliver like the food or whatever. Like the grocery shop will arrive, and the guy will just be like, "Oh yeah, so you've got chickens, yeah, and oh those trees are really big. The trees." And it's just like about the stuff they can see. So it's not even like how's your family. It's just like remarking on random features of the environment. Like those people are wired in a strange way that I don't quite get.
Yeah, well, how's your family might be a better question than what I'm used to. It's usually like the same 3 fucking questions. I'm like, God damn it, there needs to be a course on this. Like, for fuck's sake, like, this is really enjoyable. Just ask me literally anything else. Like, ask me, like, what's the stupidest thing you've ever done? Or, like, I don't know, just something else, personally, is what the way it might make me a bit more alive. I'm not a huge fan of small talk, but I don't know, maybe there's some context where all the small talkers can get together and ask each other the same questions, and maybe that's what they get off on. I don't know. But so there's lots of people like that only thrive in specific groups. I think it is an overcomable problem personally, but it's quite difficult and requires like work like anything else. Yeah. So the effort would be to keep trying, I think, but I don't know. I'm trying to fix this problem myself. I've slowly gotten better and better at it over time. And that's why we have the podcast, to have talks with more people. One of the reasons anyway. So let's go back to poker. And what are these other interesting things that you help people to fall in love with the game besides the Lilesiba?
So we at Carrot Corner, we have a very big course, which is called the Carrot Poker School, that I made a few years ago. And the idea with that is that it was to be a university style course. So I can ask myself, what would it look like if poker was an academic subject like philosophy? And there was a video course that served the purpose as being like the core textbook for the subject or whatever. So we created that. It's like 3 different theoretical grades, 1, 2, and 3 of like different levels of poker theory. And that has various solver inputs in it and explanations and theorems that have names and stuff like that. And it's mostly PowerPoint based. And then we have like grade E, which is a bit more mass data based, like what do humans do here? What does the data say on fold frequencies when you triple here or there? So the main thing that I did to try and give people a love for learning poker was actually treat it like an academic subject and create like a big, massive, sprawling course on it. But yeah, what I'm working on just now is more of it's called Weapons of War, and it's like, here are 10 lines that most poker players don't actually have in their inventory. Like, not a lot of people that are playing 50 NL online or 100 NL online have 3x River Jam as part of their strategy, right? A lot of people don't have...
That's true.
Or they don't have like a B33 turn probe in a spot where it's warranted. So that's what I'm doing currently, and that's what I'm really inspired about. But my life's work, my blood, sweat, and tears in poker is definitely the Carrot Poker School, and trying to make poker like a really academic thing.
Okay, so now, are there elements in your lectures that make it particularly interesting? Do you have very compelling ways of... Can you give like one of your lectures that is very popular that, because there's ways of delivering content that are much more interesting than others. You kind of have to, you know what you have to do? You have to like see, it actually is a bit relevant to poker, but you have to see where someone's, intrigue is going to be brought out. Like you have to see something, you have to pose a kind of question that's either going to surprise them or make them ask the question, "Ooh, what's this? What's a little deeper?" Like that sort of thing. It's as if like telling a story in a kind of way. Yep. You almost have to. Okay, so this does make sense to you, because in poker, you kind of have to reverse that process. You have to see the emotional barriers that they're likely to face and exploit them. In this case, you have to see those emotions that come up in their minds and not exploit them, but like kind of empower them. it's, you see what I'm saying? There's a weird difference between those two processes.
Absolutely.
This, by the way, made me fall in love with storytelling a little bit. So me realize, oh, okay, so now there's an element to the seemingly random orderlessness of the universe where now it actually has a life to it because we can give it some kind of life through stories. So yeah, why don't you go ahead on your lectures?
Sure, I'll just give you like a random example from the Character Poker School then. So we have grade 2, lecture 2, I believe it is. So it's like the intermediate theory grade. And there's a rule in there. We have a lot of rules and theorems that have like names, right? So this one is called Blunder Theorem. And it's like what I think is one of the most misunderstood but important things to get about how poker works. So just as a preface to this, when I talk about poker theory, I'm kind of meaning like the laws of physics of poker, like the nuts and bolts, the things that drive EV and the objective, right? Before any exploitative stuff comes in there. And Blunder Theorem in the Character Poker School is described as a situation where ranges are very lopsided, like very asymmetric. One range is much stronger than the other when they arrive on the river. So the classic example of this is button opens, big blind calls, button C bets the flop with most of range for 1/3 pot, big blind calls, turn goes check, check, and the board doesn't change in any dramatically meaningful way for button's range. Like it's not the case that a big overcard like a king lands on the river or something like that. And in that spot, big blind is going to have the vast majority of the pot share in EV. They're going to be like 62% pot share EV or something like that. And what that means is that if they bet any sizing, they're going to have way more fold equity than the break-even point for that bet size. So if they lead for 1/3 pot, they're getting way more than 25% folds, right, in a spot like this. That's called Blunder Theorem because it doesn't matter what your blockers are. It's not important. If your hand is sufficiently devoid of showdown value, betting is theoretically far better than checking on these notes. So in the Character Poker School, we have a picture of a river. We have someone drowning in it because they're checking, like waving a check thing or something like this. I don't remember the exact graphic. And we have like Blunder Theorem. You have to bet the river after these action sequences, and here's why. And what I find is that when I work with someone one-to-one who's actually taken the course, they'll just use this terminology. They'll just rattle it off. And that's how I know I've done a good job of the semantics. They're using the terms and stuff from the course because they've been clear enough and they've been meaningful enough, rather than just being like, these combos bluff and these combos bluff and fold equities high here. I try and give things a bit of life and character, like you're saying, storytelling.
Oh, okay. Yes, that makes quite a bit of sense. And I could see how there's an element of branding in there where may help people to latch on to these sorts of ideas. By the way, this is I learned that there's lots of hidden variations of this in the past. Actually, there's elements of branding, and it's a bit of a non sequitur for a second, but I personally found this really interesting. There's lots of branding in the ancient religions and things like that. People just don't realize that the whole Hindu system and the tree of knowledge is basically in the Judaistic system, or excuse me, the Kabbalah system is branding. That's the whole reason that they got it there. But it reminded me of that stuff. But anyway, so back to poker stuff. Are there any other theorems that you find particularly useful for beginners that they should learn, or very interesting to beginners might be a better word?
Sure. How about Greed Theorem and Glutton Theorem? These are
what are those
cool
theorems?
So Greed Theorem is the idea that if you are in a spot where your opponent is not supposed to raise you a lot, like they have quite a condensed range and you have a more polarized range usually, the maximum EV sizing in poker theory is going to be the biggest one if you have the nuts. So if you have a set and you've tripled and there's SPR2, you've got 2 pot size bets left on the river, and it's a spot where villains condense, it's not like a flush card or something that's going to repolarize them. If you go small, you're not really getting raised that much. Therefore, mathematically, there's a proof in the Character Poker School, a little table of bet sizes, how often those would get called if the opponent's defending at quote unquote correct frequency, and then the EV that would be generated by those bet sizes. So Greed Theorem is the idea that you should always use the biggest bet in a spot like that theoretically, and therefore you'd need a really good exploitative reason not to do so. Glutton Theorem is the big cousin of Greed Theorem. It's kind of like SPR is 4 now, and yes, you should go all in theory for 400% pot. That one's a bit weirder exploitatively. There are spots where that causes a range fold and stuff like that, so you have to be a bit more careful or do it more bluff heavy. But yeah, I like to name all of these theorems because that's what happens in academic subjects, right? Like things are labeled, they're named, there are theories. It's not just look at this range chart, look at this hand, look at this sim. So yeah, we have lots of them. I forget what they all are now, but there's probably many, many more examples that I could think about.
Well, it sounds like you're giving theorems and basically like themes of ideas, whatever word we want to use for it, to lots of situations that are just conceptualized situations that if you were to look in the solver, wouldn't necessarily show those. Or if you'd even look at the GTO theory, it wouldn't necessarily show those all the time too, unless someone like happens to have the perfect strategy. Is that right?
Yeah, like unless you are very good at pattern recognition and you've seen the pattern so many times, you might not actually spot that. So you might study a sim and see like, oh, these hands go all in here, but until it's put in a more, I don't know, I guess like a more flavorful way, like, oh, it's Greed Theorem and there's a picture of a huge fat guy raking in chips or whatever, right? Like this is kind of, we're a bit goofy at Carrot Corner, right? The brand is a little bit lighthearted as well as being serious. It's kind of a bit of a paradox that way. But yeah, until you actually give things different connotations, it can be so difficult to teach something. Like you can say something to someone that's literally the exact same in semantics, like as another statement. So there's like two different ways that I could express that concept to you. They're both exactly the same, but one allows you to understand it. You just get it with one formulation, but you don't get it with the other formulation, right? Because that's just how humans are. It needs to be put a certain way sometimes. And I've been accused, not accused as such formally, but like people have left comments on Reddit or YouTube videos of mine or something saying, this Pete Clarke guy, he just makes up new words, new terms for stuff that already exists, right? As a criticism. Like, so I say true EV. This is a big thing that we say at Carrot Corner, true EV. And people are like, he just means EV. Like, why is he saying true EV? Like, it's the same thing. Like, this is just stupid. But what I mean when I say true EV is the EV in real life, right? The idea is that the EV of one option will be better than the other in most real life cases, even though in an equilibrium sim, it will level off in a lot of nodes and it'll be the same and you'll be indifferent. But when I say true EV, I'm kind of meaning if you look up the EV in your solver, it will be the same whether you bet this turn or check this turn, but very likely the true EV of one line is better than another. And yes, I do just mean EV when I say true EV, but I'm trying to put it in a way that makes people's brains like click and, you know, gets them to respond to it.
Okay. But when we're thinking of true life EV, are you factoring in things such as the time spent and the effort put in and the opportunity costs and things like that? Or we're talking just strictly like the decision in the moment for what yields the most money? What's the true EV? Is it just a representation of EV in terms of, okay, why don't you explain?
Yeah, internal to the game. So true EV doesn't factor in anything like opportunity cost or real life decisions or anything like that. There would be a true EV for life as well. Like you could put it in that way and say you could try and work out the EV for various choices in life. That's not something I've dabbled in, but true EV basically means you're playing, let's say the student's playing 100 NL, they face a c-bet of 1/3 pot from cutoff on king 6-4 two-tone, and they have some hand that is like an optional raise in equilibrium, right? Like in a sim, they have, I don't know, king 6-4, so they have 8-7, they have a gutter. And true EV there is at 50 NL or something, is that raising relatively small is probably higher EV against that pool than calling, because there's a perceived overfold there when you look at like how they're meant to react and stuff like that. So true EV is basically just like the difference between like the theory EV and like against this population what we think is better. It doesn't go into like it doesn't reach outside of a hand of poker. It doesn't think about balance or the next 100 hands you play against someone or anything like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah. This concept makes sense to me. I do things like that all the time. Like that's usually, I mean, one thing that I'll mention is that I see this mistake all the time is where people see something's bad or good, depending on like the level of intelligence that it requires to do it. which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the actual EV of something. Sometimes it's actually not a bad idea to do some stupid things, and then get people to think you're stupid, and that are relatively costless. And sometimes people just say, oh, because someone did this, they're stupid. This is like actually quite a fallacy, because like it matters what the EV is. And I mean, there's probably equivalents to chess and then fighting or whatever strategy game where you can do some things that look stupid as fuck, and then people can underestimate because of that. So what matters to me when I think of something that's bad or good, there's always the things that are okay that don't require some deep, strong intellectual depth, but that just aren't optimal, and they're just okay. They're not going to yield the perfect result. So it sounds like what you're getting at is looking at really not just stepping away from the rigid theory and the rigid what fucking GTO wizard or whatever tells you to do.
Yeah, and also trying to teach people that frequencies in a solver aren't representative of even theoretical EV, let alone like real life EV. So like students will often say stuff like, GTO wizard prefers calling this combo to raising this combo on the flop. And I'll say, well, what do you mean it prefers it? It's like, well, the bar is almost all orange. It's doing it 85% of the time. It prefers it. And it's like trying to get people to understand that, like, how rigged equilibrium actually is in a sense, because it is like a Nash equilibrium seeking algorithm. It's like literally trying to make the ranges indifferent wherever it can. It is trying to maximize EV, but it's also causing mass indifference by nature. And it's trying to get people to see that, like, in the real world, you don't just get this random arbitrary indifference all over the place. Like, it would actually be another thing from the Clarke Poker School is, what are the chances that your chair that you're sitting on and my chair contain the same number of atoms? Like, what are the chances of that being true? Not a lot, right? Actually, in the Clarke Poker School, it's castles and bricks. We both have a castle. What are the odds that your castle and mine have the same number of bricks? And people like don't realize sometimes that when they're learning the game, these low stakes players that we specialize in teaching, that when they're looking at a sim, they're actually looking at something that's rigged so that the two chairs do contain the same number of atoms in many spots. And that's just very weird and not the case in reality. And that's where true EV comes in.
Oh, okay. That's an interesting analogy. Seems like you're applying your philosophical background to poker.
Got to do something with it, right?
Yeah, tell me about it. Otherwise, what use is it? Or it sounds closer to practical philosophy. All right. So, is there anything else that you're doing in poker or in real life that has got your attention? Or is there all your effort put on the business school, or excuse me, all your effort put on the business of teaching poker?
All my professional work effort is about teaching poker. I do play little bits, nothing serious. I don't really play live anymore. I play to make content mainly, and I have to do that because if I don't, poker becomes too arbitrary. It becomes like too much of just a weird object that I'm studying. So I think you do have to get in the mix sometimes. But yeah, 95% of what I do at work, in a work day, actually, I give myself 8 to 5. I think I said this to you when we were messaging before, like 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. hours. And I actually, it's kind of funny, right? We're talking about people that take up poker so they don't have to work a 9 to 5. And I run a poker training company and I've chosen to work basically 9 to 5, right? So within that time, it's some coaching, it's a lot of marketing, it's a lot of like branding, designing, recording footage, recording courses, liaising with editors, liaising with coaches that make content for our subscription service that we have going on at the moment, and coming up with new business ideas, meeting with like tech people, meeting with like business strategy guy, meeting with assistant, making sure assistant's done emails, checking that, just all the stuff that comes with it, right? I just never realized how much other stuff would come with setting up a company and running it and all of that. And I love it. Like, I love it. It's like a game within a game. I can't get enough of it sometimes, but yeah, it takes up all my time. So work-wise, that's really it. And then I do other things outside of work. Like I love bridge. I think bridge is, your audience will absolutely hate me, but I actually think it's objectively a better game than poker. You can't really do it for money. Yeah, I do. I think it's a better game. If I have to be honest.
Why is that?
There's just something like more, there's something more eloquent and deep about it. Like there's 13 cards in each hand. There's a language of bidding. I don't know how much you know about bridge. Have you ever dabbled?
I've played with my grandma.
Okay. So you know that there'll be a bidding phase first, right? Where you sort of like communicate things about your hand to your partner. It's a partnership game. And that's like a language. So that's really, really fascinating. You can communicate stuff and use judgment with what to say. But I guess the biggest part of it that I love is the card play phase, like where you actually play out the hand. And there's just something about having 26 cards at the same time. Because when you're a declarer in a hand, you have your 13 cards and you have the 13 cards of the dummy as well, which becomes like your other hand opposite you that you could use. And like working out where all these different cards are. Some of them are irrelevant because like the 3 of clubs and the 5 of clubs are functionally the same in a game of bridge. Neither of them really do anything. But yeah, just that like detective work of figuring out where all these different bits and pieces are and then what the best line is to maximize your chances of making the contract or doing well. And it's not that poker isn't like that. Poker's like that on a range level, because when you're doing poker, you have these ranges and you have all these different bits and bobs. I think like where poker is a bit of a worse game is that there's a lot of just dead nothingness in poker. There's just being dealt 9-4 offsuit and just looking at your hand and then folding it in the hijack. And that doesn't exist in bridge. You don't get that nothingness. That doesn't exist in many games. If you look at chess, there's no moment where you're just folding 10-8 off under the gun. It just doesn't exist. That's very particular to poker, that kind of inertia that just goes, that's a lot of the game.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems with poker. I'm not sure how to solve that one. I mean, that would be an interesting thing to solve. If there's like some kind of way to solve that, it would make the game a lot more enjoyable. Like, cause fuck, man, live poker does need that fix specifically. That's a brainstorming session right there. Mm-hmm. It could be interesting to play some bridge and see if there's something to be taken from it to add to poker. That might be a potential idea. And there's like other forms of poker that are a bit more enjoyable. There's or do kind of go in that direction somewhat. There's never really been a team poker, but one thing is that there's a structure where it's like all antes and everyone's playing most hands a lot, and that kind of solves the problem a little bit. Not all the time, because you still have to like limp fold a bunch of stupid combos. So it like gets a little closer anyway. Mm-hmm. But I could try playing some bridge. We'll see how that goes. And it's an idea.
I think you'd like it. It's a very logical game.
Oh, for sure. Well, there's loads of games that have lots of logic to them. It's where the whole strategy comes in. Like this is a game. Podcasting is a game too, actually. And so is a lot of things in the real world. Business too. It's just you have to get used to the ways of doing things. And some games, business is probably way the fuck harder, to be honest. But here we are. Anyway, any last words before we wrap things up? You want to mention the Carrot Corner, one of your books?
Sure. If you're able to give people a code, let's call it Jungle 20. If that works for you, then if they put that in, I can set up so they get 20. Anyone that listens to this podcast gets 20%. Anything at Carrot Corner, if you're able to do that, then Jungle 20 is your code. I hope I've been of use to people. I hope it's been something a bit different. I know a lot of people you have on here are from the live poker world and they're more known as players, and I'm a bit of a unique case. I'm the weird carrot guy, but I hope it's been useful for people listening to anyway. And yeah, check out Carrot Corner if you want to see any of our stuff, or our YouTube channel, Carrot Corner Poker Education.
Actually, yeah, you've had some interesting stuff that's different and some stuff that's very applicable to the real world. A lot of stuff with branding in a way that's a bit more fun and helps people to understand where they didn't necessarily before. By the way, there are many mechanisms of source in the real world, just people don't realize them and often think they're bullshit. But it's not really how things work. A lot of like things that look like, well, I'd have to go into the spiritual or the ancient ways of describing things quite a bit, but basically people just came up with different systems to describe stuff. And it looks strange from the outside or from different perspectives. So yeah, you have that, and the stuff on therapy is really interesting, and psychology. Excuse me. All right, well, Jungle 20, guys, and thank you, Pete, for your time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.